War is often described as a hell of fire and steel, but in the summer of 1915, at the Osowiec Fortress, the soldiers were about to face a nightmare that didn't burn, it choked. The fortress was a vital choke point in Poland, a wall of stone and grit that stood between the German Imperial Army and the heart of the Russian Empire. For months, the German heavy artillery, including the monstrous Big Bertha guns, had pounded the fortress. They had fired hundreds of thousands of shells, turning the ground into a lunar landscape. But the Russians didn't break. They sat in their damp underground tunnels, covered in dust, holding the line. The German commanders were frustrated. They realized that high explosives were not enough to dislodge the Russians. They needed something more efficient, something that could crawl into the deepest cracks of the earth. On the morning of August 6th, the wind shifted in favor of the Germans. At 4 a.m., the Russian sentries saw a strange yellowish-green fog rolling across the no-man's land. It wasn't the morning mist. It was a wave of chlorine and bromine gas, a cocktail of silent death that turned the air into acid. To understand the horror of that moment, you have to realize that the Russians had no gas masks. They had no chemical suits. As the thick, heavy clouds settled into the trenches, the men began to realize that every breath was a death sentence. The gas reacted with the moisture in their lungs, creating hydrochloric acid inside their bodies. They weren't just suffocating, they were dissolving from the inside out. They used wet rags soaked in water or even their own urine to cover their faces, but it was a desperate, futile gesture against the tide of poison. The scene inside the fortress was like something out of a fever dream. Men were collapsing, their skin turning blue and green. The greenery in the surrounding forest withered and turned yellow in seconds. Even the brass of the Russian artillery pieces turned black from the chemical reaction. The Germans waited, watching through their binoculars as the fog swallowed the fortress. They were convinced that nothing, absolutely nothing, could survive that concentration of poison. Before we witnessed the moment the German infantry begins its march toward what they thought was a tomb, I want to ask you a question. How much can a human being endure before the spirit breaks? If you find these tales of extreme resilience fascinating, please hit the like button and subscribe. We are diving into the darkest corners of history, and your support helps us keep the flame of memory alive. Now, back to the poison fog of Osowiec. Thinking they were merely walking into a graveyard to collect the keys, the German commanders sent 7,000 soldiers forward. They marched in neat, disciplined lines, rifles shouldered. They didn't expect a fight. They expected to find thousands of corpses. As they climbed over the Russian trenches and approached the inner walls of the fortress, the fog began to lift. The silence was absolute. The Germans moved closer, stepping over the blackened grass, confident that the battle was already won. But then, the ground began to move. Out of the smoke and the settling gas, shapes began to rise. At first, the Germans thought they were seeing hallucinations. These weren't soldiers, they were apparitions. About 60 men, the remnants of the 13th Company, were standing up. Their faces were wrapped in blood-soaked rags. Their eyes were bloodshot and bulging. They were shaking, barely able to hold their rifles. But as they looked at the German lines, they didn't look like men who were afraid. They looked like men who had already died and were coming back for a debt. The German advance stopped. The soldiers in the front ranks began to tremble. They heard a sound that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. The sound of 60 men coughing up pieces of their own lungs, spraying blood onto their bayonets, and letting out a guttural, terrifying roar. The dead men were not staying down, they were charging. Against 7,000 German troops, these 60 ghosts were about to launch the most terrifying counterattack in the history of modern warfare. The German soldiers were seasoned veterans. They had faced artillery barrages, bayonet charges, and the brutal reality of trench warfare. But they had never faced the supernatural. As the 60 survivors of the Russian 13th Company stumbled forward, the Germans didn't see an enemy army. They saw a nightmare made flesh. The Russians were covered in chemical burns. Their skin was peeling off in strips, exposing raw muscle. They were literally spitting out fragments of their own lungs, their breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps that sounded like the rattling of dry bones. This was the attack of the dead men. It wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated defiance from the threshold of the grave. The Russian commander, Sub-Lieutenant Kalinsky, despite being mortally wounded by the gas, led his men from the front. They didn't run, they couldn't. They limped, they crawled, and they dragged themselves toward the German lines with their bayonets fixed. To the 7,000 Germans watching this, the laws of nature had been broken. These men should have been dead. Every medical and scientific logic dictated they should be corpses. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. The German front lines, composed of thousands of men, began to waver. The sight of these undead soldiers, their eyes wide with a mix of agony and madness, was too much for the human mind to process. A wave of primal terror washed over the German ranks. It started with a few men in the front dropping their rifles and turning to run. Within seconds, that small ripple of fear turned into a tidal wave of absolute, uncontrolled panic. Before we explore the chaotic retreat where the Germans became their own worst enemy, I want to take a moment. If you are gripped by this story of the sheer power of the human spirit in its final moments, please leave a comment below. What would you do if you were in those trenches? Your engagement helps us bring more of these visceral historical moments to the world. Don't forget to subscribe for the final conclusion. Now, back to the slaughter at the fortress gates. The retreat was not a retreat, it was a stampede. 7,000 German soldiers, the elite of the Kaiser's army, were fleeing in terror from 60 dying men. In their desperation to escape the ghosts of Osowiec, the Germans lost all discipline. They tripped over each other, falling into their own barbed wire entanglements. They became trapped in the very obstacles they had set up to keep the Russians in. Men were trampled to death by their own comrades. The panic was so intense that they didn't even stop to fire back. They just ran, driven by the singular, terrifying thought that death itself was chasing them. The Russian survivors didn't stop despite the acid still burning in their throats. Despite the fact that their hearts were failing, they opened fire with what little strength they had left. The Russian artillery, seeing the German lines break, began to rain shells down on the retreating masses. The fields in front of Osowiec turned into a killing floor. The dead men stood on the ramparts, their silhouettes etched against the lifting fog, watching as an army 10 times their size disintegrated in a cloud of dust and fear. Sub-Lieutenant Kotlinski and his men had achieved the impossible. They had traded their final moments of life for the survival of the fortress, but the price was total. One by one, as the adrenaline began to fade and the Germans disappeared over the horizon, the Russian soldiers began to fall, not from bullets, but from the poison that had been inside them all along. They had stayed alive just long enough to see the enemy run. They had held the gates of the empire with their bare hands, and now, the ground was finally calling them back. The Germans would never forget that morning. Those who survived the attack of the dead men would tell stories for years about the soldiers who refused to die. They would speak of the blood-soaked rags and the terrifying hollow eyes. They had learned a bitter lesson. You can kill a soldier with gas. You can break his body with shells. But there is a spark in the human soul that fire and poison cannot touch. But the fortress was still standing, and the war was far from over. The legend was born, but the ultimate sacrifice of Osowiec was only just beginning to be understood by the world. The attack of the dead men was a victory that defied the laws of medicine and war. But it was a victory bought with the lifeblood of every man who stood on those ramparts. As the German army retreated in total disarray, the silence that returned to the Osowiec fortress was heavy and haunting. Sub-Lieutenant Kotlinski, the man who led the ghostly charge, did not survive the evening. By sunset, most of the 13th Company had succumbed to the internal chemical burns that had been liquefying their lungs throughout the fight. They had lived just long enough to see the enemy flee a final, grueling act of willpower that has few parallels in human history. But the struggle for Osowiec was not yet over. The Russian High Command looked at the maps and realized that despite the heroics of the dead men, the overall front was shifting. The fortress, which had stood unconquered for hundreds of days, was at risk of being completely encircled. The order finally came: evacuate. But the Russians were determined that if they couldn't have Osowiec, the Germans wouldn't have it either. In late August 1915, the remaining engineers began the somber task of rigging the entire complex with explosives. Before we reveal the final, explosive end of the fortress and how this story transformed from a military report into a legendary myth, I want to thank you for sticking with us through this dark journey. Stories like the attack of the dead men remind us that history isn't just about dates, it's about the limits of human endurance. If you appreciate this level of deep dive storytelling, please subscribe and hit the bell icon. Your support is the only reason we can keep these ghosts alive. Now, let's witness the final collapse of Osowiec. The evacuation was as disciplined as the defense had been. Every gun that could be moved was taken. Every shell that couldn't was prepared for demolition. On August 22nd, the last Russian soldier stepped out of the gates. Moments later, a series of massive explosions rocked the Polish countryside. The stone walls, the deep bunkers, and the tunnels that had seen so much blood and poison were reduced to a mountain of rubble. When the Germans finally dared to return to the site, they didn't find a fortress to occupy. They found a graveyard of broken stone, a monument to a resistance they could never truly break. The attack of the dead men became a powerful symbol in Russian military culture, a story of the Russian soul that refuses to yield even to death itself. For decades, it was told in hushed tones, a tale of horror and pride. But beyond the nationalism, there is a deeper universal truth in what happened at Osowiec. It serves as a grim reminder of the dawn of chemical warfare, a period where humanity invented new, terrifying ways to destroy itself, and yet the human spirit found new, terrifying ways to survive. Today, the ruins of Osowiec are overgrown with green grass and trees. The yellow fog of chlorine has long since dissipated, replaced by the fresh air of a peaceful Poland. But if you visit the site, you can still feel the weight of the past. There is a small monument there, dedicated to the men who coughed up their lives to hold the line. They weren't fighting for a political ideology or a distant czar in those final moments. They were fighting for the man to their left and the dignity of not dying in silence. The legend of the dead men is a dark mirror held up to the face of war. It shows us the worst of what we can do to each other, but also the absolute peak of what we can endure. As long as we remember the 13th Company and their bloody charge, they are no longer ghosts. They are a reminder that even in the face of the most silent and certain poison, the human heart can still find the strength to roar. Thank you for watching this 3-part series on the attack of the dead men. History is full of shadows, and we are here to shine a light on them. I'm your host, and this was the Nightmare of Osowiec. Until the next battle, remember, some legends never stay buried.